Hey, Dub, I'm recording. Oh, God.
Let me just make sure you have a cold.
I woke up with the worst allergy attack. I screw the groundhog, man. My sinuses say spring is around the corner. Normally, if this were something else, but no, you're gonna see me wipe my nose from time to time
So
because
maybe we don't post them this week.
I have no problem. I mean, it's real. It's like
It's true. It's real. It's real.
exactly.
I'm not sure. How does my
I have
shot
no
look right
problem with
now?
it. Your shot looks good.
It's
You could
fine.
come angle down just a little because you have a lot more headroom than I do. A little
Okay.
bit. Try to match my headroom. See how there's oh, it looks like I got two fingers. There we go.
That's okay.
Yeah.
And does it look like do I look like I'm looking at you or do I look like I'm staring off into like
Look at the green dot and
I'm
look at the
trying to.
I know it's hard. I know it's
Trying.
hard. It's super awkward.
Does it seem okay now?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Well,
Okay.
I actually, you know what? I have no idea because I'm looking at the green dot.
Oh, that's right. I feel like my eyes are like
Welcome to
this now.
online broadcasting, Dominic. 4 years after the fact, but still.
It's like, okay, just
So you
trying
ready
to
to start the
sit.
show? Hi, I'm Jenna,
And I'm Dom, and we're both award-winning journalists.
who've recently been laid off.
Our industry is experiencing a seismic shift, and it's shed a lot of really good journalists.
So where does that leave us? Well, we're definitely laid off.
And we're looking for new jobs, looking for what's left of the industry, and what to do next.
And we're looking at all of it. So if you're a fellow laid off journalist, a working journalist, or someone who admires the craft, we're looking to build community.
Develop new skills, and try to figure out what just happened.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking. Well, what a week.
Oh, wow. So much has been happening.
I know. Well, okay, so I would say the highlights for the podcast has been let's see. One super huge and big shout out to Jake Howitt. Gave us access to his music catalog. He is the former director of a little national show called The Takeaway. And even though that show ended, he is also an just brilliant audio mastermind and also a composer. And so he let us use some of his music. And now we have a proper new theme song. And we launched, what else was it? A video promo that we
Yep.
did. We launched that. And we both put on our Brave pants and we started with some video highlights. And I believe this is going to be our first fully video podcast on
You,
YouTube.
you mean I put on my brave pants because you've been
Okay,
brave long before me, and I'm the one who is finally doing this, and I hate it. Not,
it's
I
a
shouldn't say hate it.
team effort. This is really a team effort. This is more than any other
Uh,
team.
It's just so, yeah, the video part. But you know what? We always knew we wanted to build up to this, and
Hmm.
definitely as I've gotten used to the audio aspect, this is the next. I just don't know. I've told you my eyes. I don't know where my eyes go. I know where they're supposed to go, but they're not.
Again, you get used to it. You get used to it. I'm not gonna say that it's not weird. I
It's
had
very
the
weird.
head start of 3 years, during the pandemic of learning to not look at my guests while I talk to them.
Y- Yeah, it's we've done Zoom though, and I guess I just didn't pay attention to that part. I have
Because
no
you
idea
didn't
where I
have
was
to
like,
do it.
well, because you're just like it's Zoom, and you're like, all right, whatever. But yeah, now that I keep looking at myself, this is so weird. But
It
yes,
is weird. It is. It's very weird.
uh,
And at one point, we're going to talk about all of the uniquely weird stuff that goes along. I would say not just with news, but with broadcasting. But that's
yeah.
for another day.
Oh,
Today, we have some headlines, right?
you got it. So we'll start off with actually the first headline is about I'm reading from The Guardian actually. This week they announced that there are layoffs at the news entities Now This, where there was a reduction in workforce or reduction in force. Uh,
Reduction
they
is a nice
oh
way to describe it.
actually Yes, and actually that was for the Intercept, where I guess they now, yes, a reduction in force. The Intercept is they laid off 15 staff people, and then now this announced that there's going to be a 50% reduction in staff. That would
Holy
like
crap.
yeah. So um yeah, it's there's still a lot of layoffs happening around here. It's like people it's just it's never ending. But um yeah, I
Oh
mean
my God,
yeah.
50, no, 50%. That's a massacre. I mean, I don't know how big their staff is, but still, for how, I don't understand how an organization continues to function with half the people gone.
Yeah, I'm sure that must be difficult for everyone there.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess, yeah, I know
Okay.
you have a headline too, Jenna, right?
I sure do. Normally I don't do headlines, but this time I found an article that grabbed my attention as a headline. This one is from Politico. The investment firms leave behind a barren wasteland. A journalism professor blames Wall Street for the newspaper industry's collapse. And this grabbed my attention for so many reasons because I had heard rumblings about this for years. In fact, I believe very early on when I had referenced a Frontline episode about the news, I
Hmm.
can't even remember what it's called. But that was one of the subjects that they touched on was that the paper that they were focusing on, you know what, I'm not even gonna lie and say I remember which paper it was. I don't, but the point is that it had been bought by a hedge fund and that was making, just purely financial decisions that had nothing to do with news, nothing to do with journalism, nothing to do with community investment involvement, etc. Just bottom line stuff. And two women journalists who had just won a Pulitzer still got shown the door. So, anyway, but this article from Politico uh, features journalism professor and I will find out what school she teaches at. But anyway, Margot Suska, I believe. Anyway, she has a new book called Hedged: How Private Investment Funds Help Destroy America's Newspapers and Undermine Democracy. And in it, she lays out the papers that were the hard, and not the newspapers individually, but the newspaper companies that were the hardest hit by being bought by investment firms. That's Gannett, Gatehouse, Lee Enterprises. All three of those were bought by Alden Global Capital. She also lays out the fact that nationally, the percentage of newspapers that were owned by private equity went in 2001 from just 5% to 2019, 23%. Um, and then she also goes on to, say that papers like the Chicago Tribune, the Orange County Register, and USA Today, and of course, countless other smaller papers, have been just demolished again because journalism and capitalism don't really go hand in hand all the time, even though one is absolutely essential for the better, in my opinion, my very educated and not humble opinion, one is absolutely essential to the functioning
Exactly.
of a healthy democracy. Um, but you had one that actually a headline that got a lot of attention from a lot of people who were just like, wait, what?
It did. It did. Now, and honestly, it's kind of up my alley, but um it is from so the New York Times Magazine published this week how Tom Sandoval became the most hated man in America. And for those who are not, and they actually was there were two pieces. The other piece was published earlier in the weekend. It was also about Tom Sandoval's personal assistant. I think it was more of like a media story, but they published about his personal assistant, Anne, who's become like this, you know, she's become sort of like a real fan favorite. But going back to the Tom Sandoval story, so yeah, they did this piece on him, profiling him, but also
Sorry, Dom.
profiling.
I just have to unpack very quickly for any journalism wonks who might be listening to this and they're just like, who the hell are you talking about?
Okay, so
This is critical.
Tom Sandoval is one of the cast members of the reality TV show on Bravo called Vanderpump Rules. Um,
Which is
now,
about
which is about they follow. it started back in like 2012, 2013. Lisa Vanderpump, who was a cast member on Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, she owns a number of restaurants, and so they did a series where they went to her restaurant and followed a group of the people who work there. Um, it and it was a group of like 6 to 8 young people, mostly in their 20s, and many of them all having interrelationships with one another. So it was a very messy show and still is.
Yeah,
And
I just wanted to lay the groundwork that this dude is a reality star from LA.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. It's the restaurant was called Sir. And he started off as a bartender, and he also is now a bar owner, owns a couple of bars, with one with Lisa, one without. It is, yes, it's a reality show, and I love every minute of it. Watch every season. It was certainly last season, which was their 10th season. The show kind of, so it went through its ups and downs, especially over the past couple during the pandemic. It went down a little bit in terms of, ratings,
Yeah.
but not just ratings, but also like how the viewers were responding to it. And then now all of a sudden, last year there was Scandival, where Tom Sandoval had he was in a 9-year relationship with one of the other cast members, Ariana, and he and Ariana was uh he had an affair with one of her really good friends, and it blew up in media. I mean, everybody was talking about it. So now the New York Times has done a profile piece on how everybody hates Tom, and it's interesting. I mean, it's I mean, I know one thing that came out in the article that Tom did. This is the thing with Tom. He has a tendency of just saying the dumbest shit. So one thing he said here that got a lot of pickup was, so the reporter, which is Irina Alexander, she said, I asked Sandoval why he thought the scandal got so big. His response was, I'm not a pop culture historian, really, he said, but I witnessed the O.J. Simpson thing and George Floyd and all these big things, which is really weird to compare this to, I think. But you do think, in a weird way, it's a little bit the same. So she kind of tries to contextualize what he was trying to get at. But again, that blew up in social media. And Tom then ended up issuing an apology, saying, my intentions behind the comments I made in New York Times Magazine were to explain the level of national media attention my affair received. The comparison was inappropriate and ignorant. I'm incredibly sorry and embarrassed. Oh
There
boy.
is absolutely no way that that wasn't written for him. I'm sorry.
Yes.
that
Yes.
that reeks of professional apology.
But I guess I was just surprised. I mean, obviously, him saying that. I mean, Tom has done a lot of things over the years, especially between last year and now this, um, that, you expect him to say and do certain things. You're like, what the hell? But it was the fact that the Times had devoted, like, it was a 7,000 word piece to him that I think some people were just like, the New York Times, really? So yeah, and it just kind of shows just how media's, covers all different types of stories. Some of it that maybe we ask that question like, oh, that's interesting. I mean, what do you think,
Well, I
Jenna?
mean, I guess like in the I'll say this. If I'm not mistaken, Vanderpump Rules was like is the number one show in America or has the highest viewership or something along those lines. Um, so if you are interested in generating clicks and getting the public's attention, and perhaps in a crisis by any means necessary, this totally makes sense. But from a hard news perspective, and listen, I want to be very clear. This is not to throw shade on the
Hmm.
entire Housewives franchise world. I have dipped my toe in. I do love the house. Well, I love the Housewives of Atlanta. Maybe I'll love them again. But what? I also was one of those people who like not only was this someone who came across as wildly uninformed and quite proud of it, but then was given this full profile in what was supposed to be the country's most notable publication. That was just weird to me. I didn't get it.
It is it's where you have that fine line of how do you how do you ignore certain stories that are have become socially like it's out there. It's been Let's millions of people talk about this show. It's definitely one of the highest rated, definitely in the demographics. It's one of the highest rated shows that Bravo has, if not the
Hmm.
highest rated that they have. But you know, it sort of seeps into the culture. And does it merit that? I don't know. I mean, to me, I definitely know I was reading and I thought what was interesting, it wasn't just about the scandal, but it was also about this, a reality TV star and how they see themselves and how it's sort of changed and how it's also changed even how we see celebrity. So it wasn't just, I definitely felt like it wasn't just like an interview, just like, okay, let's just talk to them. It was kind of, yeah, I found it to be really fascinating. So interesting
It
piece.
was. I guess it. Okay. I don't want to belabor this point too much because we have a lot of pod to get to, but eh, the idea, the notion of fame for fame's sake or
Mhm,
infamy being the ultimate commodity now.
mhm,
Again, I guess I don't know how healthy that is for the rest of us.
true.
And then I also think of um well, one very infamous former congressman from Long Island who right after he was shown the door from Congress, George Santos, was on a comedian show, Zui, who I love, by the way. This is
Love
no
her.
shade to her. But at one point, she did ask him, "How do we make you go away?" And he looked her dead in the face and said, "Stop platforming me."
True.
I just feel like that's food for thought for all of
Yes.
us.
Sounds like.
It's like the Simpsons episode. I can't remember which one it is, but I think it was like a Halloween episode, and they were trying all of the cartoons or the mascots in town came to life and were terrorizing the citizens. And the song that they sang was, "Well, then just don't look."
Uh, well, I guess those are our headlines. And I guess we're ready to head into the our interview, right?
We sure are. And so this week, we'd like to welcome in reporter Paul Farhi. He's formerly with the Washington Post and now currently a freelance writer. Paul, welcome to Laid Off and Looking.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, when I say that you were formerly with the Washington Post, I want to be very clear. You, like us, you were not laid off.
I was not. I'm fortunate in that sense. I took among about 10% of the editorial staff a buyout that was offered in October, completed in December, and so they retired me more or less by buying me out of my employment at the Post. So it was a good deal, hard to refuse and hard to complain about. It's unfortunate. I didn't really want things to end that way, but they did, and here I am.
Well, speaking of things ending that way, I mean, I don't want to make it sound like it's an endpoint because we don't know that yet, but we are certainly news media is in just a crisis situation. So, from your perspective, what do you see what it is that's happening right now? And also, did you see this coming?
Well, this has been coming for 20 odd years. I mean, maybe since the advent of the internet, we've seen this slow decline in local newspapers and local media for years and years. What's happening now seems to be a convergence of a lot of different forces coming together, but basically they're the same old forces that have leveled local media. It's happening on a national basis, and that's really what's gathering this new round of attention. It's happening at the Washington Post, at the NBC News, at CBS, on and on and on. Lots of things are happening, and I'm not sure anybody really has a good, firm fix on exactly what the primary cause is. In fact, it's probably just a bunch of causes. There's take your pick, news fatigue, people just tired of being exposed to all of the negative news, which is sort of redundant. Negative news is basically news. Advertisers are pulling back from supporting news. Subscriptions are down. There's Trump fatigue. And, the Trump fatigue is the analog of the Trump bump we got in the national media when Trump was president and people were fascinated or horrified, take your pick, about Trump as president. Anyway, all of these factors. Oh, the social media algorithms are changing, driving people away from news. All of these things collectively seem to be happening, and it's adding up to a real disaster for national news operations. You can take your pick. There's no one who's in real good shape. Maybe the New York Times, but maybe only the New York Times.
Well, do you think it's a matter of a bad business model as well? I mean, I've heard a lot of criticism as people start to sort of unpack what the hell is going on right now. And one of the things that people have criticized is that news has an outdated business model that just doesn't work anymore.
Well, you have to take your picks and show me a business model in the news business that is working. Is it a nonprofit model? Well, no, that's not working too well. Is it the usual for-profit ad-supported model? No, that's not working too well. Subscription model, not working too well. So the disturbing thing is it's not like we can go to a new business model. They're all under pressure. They're all in the same boat. And it's not a question of a business model, really, when you look at it. It's a question of news as a commodity, as a good sold to the public. And the public is less interested or less willing to pay for that commodity. That's the scary part of this wave of capitalism. Nothing in particular works well. Small niches, maybe, the punches and the punch bowls and the small niche operations might have a better chance of doing well. But the large operations, the large newsrooms that we've known for a century or more, are under very dire circumstances right now.
Well, this is also just so that I just want to be clear because it's kind of ironic. Dom and I came from local media, but we came from local media in New York City, which is a unique animal all in of itself. But as you're talking about, the crisis with national media, I mean, does that mean that locals just are already dead?
No, I don't think it's dead. I think it's troubled and has been for a very long time. This phenomenon of news deserts, that didn't start in New York or Washington, where all the journalists are really concentrated. It happened in small towns and counties across America. There are something like 200 counties now that don't have any professional news reporting. That didn't just happen last month or last year. That was a long process of decline and failure in those operations, consolidation as well. Now it's coming to the places where the journalists are: Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, New York. Take your pick. Lots of media operations in New York are having their issues and their troubles. So we're seeing what happened on a local level roll out to larger regional and national news organizations. We're all in the same boat now, and it's leaking.
Ooh.
Well, I think it's interesting that people say that some have a distrust for national news or mass news, and they do want more of their local news. Yet people aren't turning to it. Um, and the thing to what it comes down to, I think, like Jen and I, we were discussing with you also beforehand about the trust that people have in news, and how we've seen it each year decreasing, the trust in news from the Gallup. We were looking at the Gallup where they had their poll from 1972 or 73, and just watching how back then it was 60, looking over here, 68% to 72% in the 70s where they had trust in the media, and now it's at the all-time low of what it was in 2016, which is 32% of Americans have great deal or fair amount of trust in media's news reporting. How, I guess that, obviously, if we all had the answer, we'd solve it. But what do you think of how we got here, and what can we do in terms of rebuilding that trust with the public to make them care that this business is changing, and not realizing that where are the stories going to where do you get these stories from then?
This is a very complicated issue, but you're right. The decline in trust, which is however you define trust in the news media, and however you define the news media, has been falling for decades, and it coincides with, if is not caused by, the expansion of the news media into greater and greater niches. There is an entire infrastructure, I would say, designed to tell you that the news media, is untrustworthy and lies, and this is the whole, mis and disinformation operation that goes on social media and has for years. So it's not a surprise that people, when asked by Gallup or a pollster, do you trust the media? It's a broad and bland question that any person who considers themselves smart would say, no, I don't trust the media. I saw something that I didn't like. I've been told by various commentators for years that the media is untrustworthy. Of course, I don't trust the media. But how that translates into behavior is another question. In other words, I don't trust the news media, yet by the tens of millions every single day, people consume the media, whether it's television news, whether it's their local newspaper, whether it's their blog, whether it's their preferred media. So they may say they don't trust the media, but their behavior suggests that, well, for one, they have no alternative, but two, they are going to their media to get the information and news. And when you talk about trust in media, what you're parenthetically saying is, do you trust them about political news? Well, of course, political news is one little subset of the news. There's lots of other kinds of news.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you'll see in this trust question, the breakdown of who mistrusts the media. Well, conservatives for years have mistrusted the media far more than liberals or Democrats have mistrusted the news. And why is that? Because starting in the 1960s, this was one of the campaigns of the conservative movement to tell people that the media is liberal, that the media is untrustworthy, and that you should be skeptical of the media. You should be skeptical of the media, but not necessarily for the reason that conservatives, in a very aggrandizing way, told you not to be trustful of the media. Nevertheless, this has been a campaign of conservatives, starting with William F. Buckley in the 1960s. So what's disturbing now, I think, is that the trust levels among Democrats and progressives, the people who supposedly trusted the media more so than conservatives, their trust is declining too, not at the same rate and at the same level as conservatives, but they are less trustworthy of the media. So collectively, the entire country seems to be less trustworthy of the media. Let me make one more statement
Mm-hmm.
about this, though. Trust in all institutions has declined proportionally over the same time. Congress, the president, the Supreme Court, you name it, they're showing the same trust level decline that we've seen in terms of what we've seen in the news media. So this is not unique to the news media. It's somehow, in a way, a factor, perhaps, in the way the public consumes, subscribes to, watches the news media. But I'm not sure exactly that we understand that interrelationship. Nevertheless, it is true. People say this on their surveys.
I'm also wondering how much of, I mean, as you were sort of describing news as a commodity, how much of the trust factor or the lack of trust plays into because things have fractured so much, you can pretty much go anywhere you want and hear what it is that you want to hear. Is there also a factor, perhaps, that people are becoming increasingly resistant to hearing either from people or perspectives that don't adhere to the way they view or believe they're experiencing the world?
Yeah, this is the silo idea of news consumption, that you can live in your own silo in which you are reinforcing constantly your preconceived ideas about the world. This is an undeniable phenomenon. The internet and having a phone enables you to select the media that you want, or to avoid it altogether for that matter. Um, but in some ways, I think it's overrated. If you look at the amount of traffic over the years and the news TV ratings, tens of millions of Americans every single day go to the same sources, mainstream sources, to get information, whatever you want to define as information. So it's not like people have, gone into their own silos alone to reinforce their ideas. There is some of that. But in the mainstream media, again, tens of millions of people a day are looking at the things that ABC, CNN, Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times are putting out every day. So you can overrate this silo phenomenon. You know, we're in an era now, not just of mainstream media, of course, we're in an era of social media, and social media is where this is really, truly reinforced. You friend and you follow people of like-mindedness. We're not classical liberals with a small L seeking wide ranges of information. We're seeking reinforcement and companionship through our social media. And
Mm.
that's where it gets very much,
I never thought
self-reinforcing.
about that part of it, that yes, because through social media we're looking for companionship, and so it would make
Certainly.
sense to look for like-minded people and not want to hear, even though as much as I swear to God, some people live to argue online, which I don't
Sure.
understand.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you don't want to be challenged day in and day out. I mean, I kind of like hearing from points of view that I don't hold, because I like to know what other people think. But a lot of people don't want to think that way, or don't want to consume media or information or opinion that way. They want to be told that their opinions are the right ones, and that's how they seek it out. And that's where you end up with this self-reinforcing silo. Um, but again, I would say that most people don't live that way. The numbers and the figures tell us that. People are watching, you know, mainstream TV news. They're reading mainstream news reporting less and less, but nevertheless still by the many millions.
So then I guess this sort of brings me back to my question, especially when it comes to local news, is that if people aren't necessarily tuning in, they're not subscribing, they're not engaging in that way, how do you find out what's going on in your community? And well, this is a compound question, which I know I shouldn't ask, but I will. How does that, I guess, interact with, because sometimes people find themselves relying, on their Nextdoor app or the Facebook community group to sort of keep up with what's happening. But those aren't journalistic sources. Those are just people talking. And as much as I think the moderators, who bless them, by the way, uh, do as much as they can to keep flat out lying or manipulation, or people trying to sell stuff out of there, still it's not the same thing.
I mean, this is the brave new horrible world of information consumption. It's like, what happens in a place where there is no professional, mainstream, quote unquote, objective? We can get into that whole can of worms. No professional reporting. How do you get information? Well, you get it from your neighbors. You get it from people with an agenda, people who are unreliable. My wife goes on Nextdoor, and she sees a lot of people talking about a lot of stuff going on in the neighborhood. Is it true? Well, we don't really know if it's true. I mean, someone said they saw something happen. Um, I don't know. I would trust a better source than that, but that's the way people get a lot of local information now, from their friends and from more or less unreliable witnesses. And this is what worries me about how we're going to know anything, or have any ideas or facts in common in the future, if we're all just taking information off the shelf without any authoritative reporting and any authoritative sourcing to tell us what's true and what's not true. And we're seeing it every single day. There's lots of dis and misinformation floating around, and thank you, internet, for that. I mean, I am old enough, obviously, to remember days before the internet, and when the internet first started becoming mainstream, people said this is going to be the greatest thing of all. People have access to, all of the newspapers around the world. They'll have access to libraries. Information superhighway will be smarter and better.
Those were
And
great commercials, by the way. I was sold.
sure, sure, yeah, and all of those things were true, but what we didn't appreciate is people would have access to lots and lots of bad information as well as quote unquote good information. So, it's double-edged sword time. It's a blessing and a bane.
It's interesting because you're talking about local journalism and the importance of it. And we went through a story not long ago that was broken by local journalism talking about George Santos. And yet, you know, what that's the importance of local journalism in terms of getting to the story that others really, maybe the larger media just don't, they're not hearing. They don't have the boots on the ground of people hearing what's going on. And I mean, explain a little bit about why people should care about yeah, I think people
Let's talk
they
about that for a second. Let's talk about the George Santos story because it's very instructive in a lot of different ways. To say that the North Shore Leader, which was the small weekly paper that quote unquote broke the George Santos story, says a lot and it says not very much. Because when you look at what they broke, what it was mainly opinions and suspicions about George Santos. Now, I'll give them credit for their suspicions and their insinuations about George Santos, but this was not really the kind of investigative reporting or even plain old reporting that the New York Times eventually brought after the election to the George Santos story. The other part of this is this was a small newspaper, and like all small newspapers, it had a very small readership. The district in which George Santos was running was hundreds of thousands of people. I don't know how many people saw the North Shore Leader's insinuations and suspicions about George Santos, but it wasn't a lot. So this is not really a substitute for the kinds of reporting that reporters, professional reporters, could have brought to that story if there were professional reporters paying attention to that story. And as it turns out, there were not professional reporters paying attention to that story outside of this small weekly newspaper. So there's no real way that the average voter who, you could say pays some attention, maybe not much attention, was going to know anything of value about George Santos other than A, he had run before, and B, he was the approved Republican candidate. And that was enough for them to vote for him. But the failure of local reporting on this was an extreme example of what we're facing. Now, I will step back and say that politics seems to be the last area of reporting that's going to be gutted and is going to be, ignored in the news apocalypse we're facing. There were 1,000 journalists in Iowa for the Iowa caucuses in January. Why there were 1,000, we needed 1,000 people to cover that story, I don't know. But nevertheless, that is the fact. News organizations devoted a ton of resources to that story, as they do to politics, at least national politics, all the time. So I wouldn't worry too much about missing any stories about the national campaign. But you get to these local issues and now you have a problem. So anyway, that's to set the whole George Santos context in context, the whole George Santos story in context.
Well, I think that's a great backdrop to put against, because part of the reason why you even came on our radar was that for The Atlantic, you published an article titled, "Is American Journalism Headed Towards an Extinction-Level Event? The news industry has been in decline for decades, but the latest round of layoffs is especially ominous." And again, you go through and you name, of course, all of the big names, the Washington Post, NBC News, ABC News, NPR, Vice, Fox, BuzzFeed, us, all of these places that contracted and shed journalism jobs. But doesn't that lay the groundwork for something else like a George Santos to just happen again because nobody's watching the hen house?
Yeah, it does. It absolutely does. And I'll give you another example that people don't remember. There was a guy, and I can't remember his name now. He was running for state senate in New Jersey. This is 4 years ago, and he had posted a whole bunch of, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, I think, I mean, anyway, a whole bunch of horrible things on his Facebook feed, and nobody paid any attention to this. And he was the candidate, and he won. And it was only after the fact that the local newspapers, this is in southern New Jersey, jumped in and said, "We got a problem here. This guy has said some horrible, horrible things on social media." It was too late, of course. He had been elected, just like George Santos was elected. Um, there were 4 newspapers in covering that campaign. It turns out that they just missed the story, which could happen. But again, it was another example of, if you don't pay any attention, bad things could really happen. If the watchdog is not watching, there's no way to sound the alarm. And we are facing some difficulties, not necessarily in political campaigns, although I'm using that as an example, but
Mm-hmm.
in, who goes to the city council meetings, who's watching for the corruption in local government, who's, simply reporting news of concern and importance to local communities. Well, the answer is fewer and fewer people are doing so. And that was and has been a crisis for a very long time in local media. We at the national, or regional level are just feeling the pain now for, again, a lot of the reasons we've talked about a little bit about. But this crisis has been occurring in lots of places. Again, the whole news desert phenomenon is something that should be a question of national debate and importance. It's not, but it should be. We as journalists certainly paid some attention to it, but I don't think anybody else does.
Well, I just want one more thing and this is just a personal pet peeve that sticks in my craw, is that sometimes I'll see on social media, people will pull up a local incident or something that's happening, sometimes a local story, ironically, with the caveat, the media won't talk about this, the media won't report on this. And I just want to get your take on people's assertion that somehow members of the news media intentionally don't address certain issues.
Well, the very fact that someone pulled up a clip and said, why isn't the local media covering this, shows you that the local media is covering it. Is how the heck did you know about it to complain about the fact that someone wasn't covering it, unless someone covered it, which they did. I think that statement it goes to the person making the claim, and it essentially is self-flattery. Is, I've noticed this. I find this important. Why doesn't the media find it as important as I do? And the fact is, usually, if you'd simply Googled this topic, you'd find a lot of stories about this thing that we haven't allegedly covered. And, it's a statement really also saying, I just haven't noticed the coverage of this thing that I find so important. And so I turn on the news media to say they're at fault for the thing I haven't truly noticed or looked into very, very much so. What I'd love to see in someone saying that is a story that truly was not covered, and because maybe there is something of moment. The other part of this
There
is
are tons of things that don't get the attention they should.
absolutely, that's completely true. And, there's a whole list that's put up by, I don't know which organization, about the most undercovered stories of the year. I don't know if they still do it, but there were some fascinating and important things. The other part of this particular kind of attitude is also, the notion that it's actually not what you are presenting it as, that you are misinformed, you, the person criticizing the news media for not covering this, that the story is actually not what meets the eye and not how you have characterized it. It's not a crisis. In fact, in some cases, it doesn't even really exist. It's a hoax, it's false, it's misreported by you, the critic. And so I'm very suspicious of anybody making that claim that the media didn't cover it.
It's just a pet peeve of mine. Dom, do you have
Me
any
too.
other
Me,
questions?
No, I
me
wonder.
too.
No, I wonder if it's also because sometimes people can see, because we follow our own, people will follow certain news sources or certain entities. And I wonder if it's because when they don't see it on another, like let's say whether it's conservative or liberal. So sometimes people feel like it becomes politicized in that sense. Like you're not, this other news organization isn't covering it because of the fact that you don't want people to hear about this story, or
That's
you're
right.
not
It's a
taking from
cover
that
up.
perspective. So that again, it goes back to, I think, how people have sort of see the media as no longer just about presenting the facts. It's really about opinion. And I think that that's where and it's interesting to me because it's sort of like what people complain about that they don't want to hear, yet that's exactly what it seems like they come back to complain about with things like, well, I want to hear what I think and not
Yeah.
what, no, I don't want to just hear the facts
But
because the,
let's drill down on a more basic level here, Dominic. The idea that the media isn't covering it suggests that I have surveyed lots and lots of media. Most people get their news from a few sources, not many, and sometimes only one source. So they don't really know what the media writ large is actually covering on a day-to-day basis. So if you don't see it in your preferred media, or you did see it in your preferred media, but nowhere else, you tend to think that there's some great larger cover-up going on. People have all these conspiratorial ideas about how the media agrees on things to cover or agrees on things not to cover. I don't know about you
I'm
guys, but
sorry,
I've
you should
never
be
had
in a newsroom.
yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
If you've ever been in a newsroom, we can't even get it together amongst ourselves, let alone with some other operation. We're incapable of coordinating with multiple news organizations that we're unrelated to. It's a really unsophisticated view of the media. Do we have priorities in our coverage? Of course we do. Do we have prejudices in our coverage? Of course we do. Do we always get it right? Of course we don't. But the point is like this notion that there's somehow a conspiracy and an agreement among multiple news organizations is absurd. We are not that organized. We could never be that organized to do that.
I just kind of want to go back a little bit because when you were talking about the critical nature of local media and who's going to go to the city council meeting, I also do want to throw in there that for people who aren't in a major metropolitan area, it's who's going to go to your county legislature meeting, etc. And I bring that up because I think a lot of as we've talked a lot about, national media, and national media is also very concentrated in, frankly, two spots in the whole country.
Totally,
And America's a big
completely.
place.
It's actually dangerous, I think. It's dangerous that I couldn't tell you the percentages, but a large percentage of all the people employed as professional journalists in America are in those two places, New York City and Washington, D.C. And okay, so tell me about Wyoming, tell me about Michigan, tell me about Texas, tell me about California. Those places have fewer journalists per capita, which means they have less available news coverage. And you look at even the local news in places like Washington and New York. You can't tell me that the New York Daily News, a local newspaper, is better now than it was 10 or 20 years ago. You can't tell me the New York Post is covering the city better than it was 10 or 20 years ago. The Washington Post, in its buyout, concentrated those buyouts on the Metro staff, the local news reporting of the Washington Post, which has always been, in my hundreds of years of experience having worked for them, been both a local paper and a national paper. They are moving more toward being a national, international paper and not a local paper. Now, we still have a pretty sizable metropolitan staff, but it's less sizable than it was a month or two ago because of the buyouts, which landed so heavily on that staff. And, why is that? Well, the economics of the business tell you that there are more readers, there are more potential subscribers, across America than there are in Washington, D.C. or Montgomery County or Fairfax County, our local counties. And that's how the Post is going to place its resources in chasing news of interest to those people. They don't care about the local news around here. I do as a resident of Washington, D.C., as a Washington, D.C. area. But, I am no longer the target customer. People like me are no longer the target customer of an operation like the Washington Post. So what, in essence, you have is this constant diminishment of local in favor of placing the bet on national and international news. And, all of the organizations that you named never covered a city council meeting. They were always chasing the same stories that reporters in Washington and New York were facing. So again, the concentration in New York and Los Angeles is kind of dangerous because it ignores so much of the country, and you can see the diminishment of that reporting across the country.
Dom, anything?
Do you have, I guess just because, obviously Jenna and I are both laid off and so are a lot of other journalists. And, I'm curious, you have, you're saying you'll have new journalists who will be graduating from journalism school, coming out there wanting to get, what, I guess I want to ask sort of like, what's your words of wisdom for the people out there who want to still get involved in this field at this time? And also, how about for the people who are looking, what's your advice to them in terms of what they're looking for?
I don't mean to be Debbie Downer, but as this podcast shows, it's really, really tough out there, as you all know. And I consider myself, as I've said, fortunate to be at this stage of life in my circumstances compared to someone coming up into this business. It's the kind of thing that I loved and that I had passion for, and that I know young people today have the same passion for. I don't think they have the same opportunity that I had as a young person. It wasn't easy to get my first job, but nevertheless, I got it. I got on my way, and I did okay. I wonder how young people coming out of school or in the beginnings of their career are going to do the same thing. The only thing I can suggest is keep going despite the disappointment. Keep your passion alive. Keep your fire, burning. Figure out a way to do it despite the odds against you. And there's a ton of odds against you right now. But there was a point where I was very disappointed in the way things were going in my career, my so-called career, and I considered doing something else. And I'm glad I pulled back from that, because then things kind of worked out for me. But I can understand the sense of discouragement. I can understand the idea that, I don't want to keep not earning a living or earning a very poor living at this, even though I love doing this. And, there's a certain point at which reality has to step in, and you got to eat and you got to pay rent. So I don't know, other than, you need extraordinary desire at this point in our evolution in the news media. And you have to keep knocking on doors. You have to keep facing disappointment. And you have to keep going is all I can say. And, I fear for a society that doesn't want passionate young people who are talented and hardworking and dedicated to journalism. We are going to be worse off as a society if we can't find a place for those people to operate and to work, and not just young people, but middle-aged people and older people as well. But I personally, and this, I don't mean to sound smug, I would not want to be a young person starting out, because I think it is so tough right now.
I actually really appreciate, and I'm sure people younger than me would definitely appreciate that. Let's just say a lot of people from a certain age demographic, I'm not going to go blaming a generation, can sometimes be a little paternalistic in the way that they address young. Well, I did it, so you could do it too.
No, no,
But
the
with
circumstances are different.
Yeah, completely. And one of the things that we're trying to include in all of our podcasts with our guests is if you could tell us what your journey was to becoming a professional journalism. Like, what was your story to
Sure.
fitting in this
Well,
career?
my journey is pretty simple. I'm going to make it simple. When I was 14, I was on the cross country and track team, and I wanted the school newspaper to cover what I love doing, which was track and cross country. And nobody was doing it. So I went to the paper and said, hey, why don't you guys cover us? We're great. And they said, well, we don't have anybody to do it. Why don't you do it? And so I did, and I loved it. And that from that moment on, I wanted to be a reporter. I wanted to be a journalist in my more pretentious moments. And I set myself and had this single-minded idea of that's what I wanted to do. So then I became, an amateur. I freelanced. I was a stringer, I was a sports stringer, did all these things, all the classical things that you were told you were supposed to do if you ever wanted to be a professional journalist. Went to college, applied everywhere for my first job, found my first job, made nothing for a long, long time. But I got on the ladder, and there was a ladder. I don't know if there still is a ladder where you climb from rung to rung. I'll go to the small paper, I'll go to a bigger paper, I'll get experience, I'll get contacts, I'll make contacts with people who will be my mentors or anyway. So went through the usual kind of classic small paper, larger paper, finally got to the Washington Post, which was an utter dream job for me, and stayed there for a very long time, survived really 5 buyouts until Jeff Bezos bought the paper and really put money into it and revived it. The old runway, let's give the paper the chance to succeed in this different and more difficult world. And then, got to the age, which I am now, where the buyout was more attractive than staying around. And, the handwriting, I guess, was on the wall for people of my age, and not to say my experience, but nevertheless, it wasn't the ending I wanted, as I said, but who cares? I mean, I did okay, and I'm not complaining about the result. But anyway, that's the journey. The journey was, how do you go from one level to the next level? And if, again, you're passionate, dedicated, maybe have some skill, you got there because there was opportunity. And I feel like in my heart, there isn't as much opportunity now. And that, makes me worry about younger people and middle career people as well, about what's going to happen to them. And as I say, I don't want to be smug about any of this. I got mine and got out. Well, yeah, but that doesn't tell you about what's going to happen to journalism and journalists in the future. And it's a difficult road.
Dom,
Hmm.
I think we're good.
Yeah,
Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Paul, thank you.
Yeah, sharing your thoughts. And I mean, yeah, like I said, we're still figuring this out ourselves, but I really
I
appreciate
wish
your
you luck.
insight. Thank
Thank
Well, I don't
you.
you.
know if it's insight, but I wish you luck. And, I am a great defender of journalists and journalism. And I think the critics are full of shit most of the time, some, not always, but most of the time. And I also think the cruelty toward people who are laid off as journalists, learn to code, bullshit like that, makes me really angry. And anyway, I wish you guys the best luck. Thank you for this. I find this to be a very interesting conversation, and I appreciate you asking me to do it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, that was a great conversation, but of all, he said a lot in that, and one of the things that I think is going to stick with me the most was when he pointed out that he was at the Washington Post for a long time. And I'm really starting to wonder, and this isn't just for journalism, this is just across the board, is that a privilege of the past?
Yeah, I sadly, well, I say sadly, I guess because that's what we've been used to. I do think so. I think we're seeing that less and less. I think it's everything sort of becomes more short term. Um,
Yeah.
it's going to be a rarity seeing people who stay at a place for 10 years. If anything, I think people feel like there's more value in working in some place 2 to 3 years and then bouncing to someplace else, which I
I've
guess is what
heard
we have to get
that.
used to.
I've heard that, but okay, before we get into our favorite piece of journalism, I guess what I just want to say about that is it usually takes me, and I think I'm a pretty quick study, but to really feel as though I've mastered my job and not only my job, but within the organization that I've been at. Yeah, we're talking about
Hmm.
2-ish years to really feel as though, okay, I am 100%, I understand not only what this position is, but whatever weird stuff can come at me at the last minute and how do I navigate that? That's about 2.5, sometimes a 3-year process. I don't know. I- That's
No, you bring
just,
up a good point, Jenna. You bring
I
up a good
don't
point.
know.
It's just changing, and I don't know. I guess that's the thing. We see how it all evolves and how it changes over the coming year. So yeah.
All
So
right.
on
Well,
to
we are, yes, moving on.
yes,
Okay. Moving on to our favorite pieces of journalism or pieces to highlight, I guess. Highlights? Can we say that?
sure.
I feel like that's a copyright.
Spotlight. I don't know.
Spotlight. There we go. Because I'm like, no, that last one was highlighted. Oops. I said it again. Pretty sure that's copyrighted. That was a
you want
kick-ass kids magazine. Okay.
you want to start
Um,
off with yours?
yes, I will start off with mine. So I know that at the top of the show we were talking about just the insanity of how sometimes um news can focus on how it sometimes focuses on celebrity life, etc. And whether or not Tom Sandoval, I think his name was right, was worth
Hmm.
covering. Okay. So I will say that my piece is a little fluffy, but I think for me, it spoke to a larger issue, even though it's not a local American one. So this is it. New York Magazine published a piece called Prince Harry Infuriates Royals by Saying Nice Things About King Charles. Now, again, first of all, everybody who's an American would hear that and be like, I'm sorry, what? With the care level, I totally get that. But basically, what happened is Prince Harry and Megan. Wow, I almost forgot her name. Okay. So the two of them were up in Canada, like getting ready for the Invictus Games, which is supposed to
Right.
happen next year. Okay. So it's like a promo thing. It's pretty routine, no big deal. And he gets asked by Good Morning America, oh my God, your dad just announced that he has cancer, which again is regardless of what kind of cancer he has, or what stage it is, that's still a big thing to rock a family.
Definitely. Yeah.
So excuse me, Harry says, quote, I love my family. The fact that I was able to get on a plane and go see and spend any time with him, I'm grateful for that. That is what we in a newsroom would call a non-story. There's nothing there.
Hmm.
It was this very innocuous kind of just like, I love my family. I'm glad I got to see him. Okay. Um, that's also something that we would say has no legs to it. Not
Definitely.
according to the UK media. They spun this for days to pick apart everything about, should he have even said anything? Does this mean that he's ready to return to royal work? Was his comment even
Oh my God.
appropriate? Was seriously, should he never have said anything? Like blah 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 blah. And sometimes when uh I hear people complain about the media being unserious. I sometimes wonder if this is an example of that. He said nothing. He really said nothing. Just, I love my family. I'm glad I got to see them. I can't think of anything more innocuous to respond to, I heard your dad got cancer, than that. And yet it generated days and all kinds of content, albeit this would have been in the UK, not America, but still just an example of how sometimes something that is doesn't really affect people at all. Like
Mhm.
he's not a working royal. They're not paying for him. And yet this is all anybody can talk about for days.
You
Okay.
know my love. You know my love of the royals, which is I just don't care about their stories. But I have always had an affinity towards Harry and Meghan.
Yeah.
I don't know. I they don't bother me, and I think I like what they're trying to do in terms of their philanthropy work, and but I just don't understand like picking apart things to the point it's like it's one of those things that you can't do anything right. It's like no matter what he does, it's wrong. If he said nothing, he gets slammed. If he says something, he gets slammed. So, you know what? Hopefully, yeah, this.
Yeah, it's not an American story, but it just sort of struck me because the
Mhm,
reporting that story was in New York Magazine was very straightforward. Just, he was
mhm.
up there. But if I can read the opening paragraph, have you ever had a moment when you're relentlessly complaining about someone and then you suddenly realize that actually you're the problem? It seems that such a revelation is long overdue for Britain's royal family and many royal commentators. And that's what kind of got my attention, was just like
Mhm.
now, on top of that, I also want to say that another piece, because as much as I do enjoy a good silly piece of news or gossip or whatever, I also do try to follow what's going on in my local community. And so for my local community, one of my local papers would be the Kingston Freeman, and or excuse me, the Daily Freeman is its name. Kingston Freeman is what we call it. And so anyway, they recently published a piece that's actually very, very important. New York legislators consider good cause eviction law again. And so for a few things about New York State that people might not know, New York City is very famous for having rent control. We have a well, not we. New York City has a rent control guidelines board. Every so often when they change the rules about rent increases, etc., there is always a protest. Some might even say a show at those meetings, so that's a big deal. But once you leave New York City, there's really no protections or guidelines when it comes to how landlords can manage their properties. So, this law came into existence called Good Cause Eviction, and its purpose is to protect tenants from unreasonable rent hikes and retaliatory or discriminatory evictions. So, currently, when a lease expires for most renters or homes in New York State, want to be very clear, New York State, the landlord can choose not to renew it for any reason whatsoever and raise the rent as high as they want to. Under the current legislation, something like failure to pay rent, a substantial lease violation, being a nuisance to your neighbors, etc., those are now legal purposes to qualify for a good cause eviction. But you can't just like be kicking people out of their homes left and right because the market has suddenly changed, especially in a place like the Hudson Valley, and you're now realizing I can make bank if I can just get rid of these broke people. So that's what this law is trying to address, and that's a very, very important local issue, especially in the Mid Hudson region.
Wow, that's a wild story. Thank you, Jenna.
No, you're
Um,
welcome.
so I have one story, and that is it was actually an Atlantic story. Um,
Mhm.
the title is Why Americans Suddenly Stopped Hanging Out. Too Much Aloneness is Creating a Crisis of Social Fitness. It's by Derek Thompson. He's a journalist there. Actually, did he touches base basically as part the article is looking at how Americans are hanging out less and less socially. They look at the numbers. He looks at data indicating why that's happening. Um, and it's a lot of, and also what's the impact on us in terms of the fact that we are spending less time socially with one another, the impact it's having on teens, young people, which ends up being meaning depression. A lot of we'll want to read something over here where he talks about uh, so from 2003 to 2022, American men reduced their average hours of face-to-face socializing by about 30%. For unmarried Americans, the decline was even bigger, more than 35%. For teenagers, it was more than 45%. Um, and it isn't just about the pandemic. It's been happening for a while. And, he goes into the reasons as to like why that's happening. One thing he mentions is, of course, technology,
Mm-hmm.
phones, televisions, our computers. Like people have more ways of communicate. Video games. People have more ways of communicating with one another, not just being face to face. And then there's also the whole issue of less. There are less places, less gathering places for people to meet up. Um,
Ooh.
and again, there is, and the article is really interesting. I don't want to give it all away here, but I do think it just stirs up this conversation of how important it is for us to have face-to-face socialization and how that I think it's basically trying to figure out what are ways we can improve on that with all of us, but especially for next generations who are kind of you just don't want the whole thing is what's the impact of growing up in a bubble of not
Being a
being
digital native.
exactly. So I thought that was a really great piece, and hopefully people will check it out.
All right. Well, of course, we're going to put links to all of the articles that we mentioned in the show notes. And of course, I don't know, Twitter handle for Paul, who was, again, great to talk to. So thank you to Paul. Thank you guys again for rocking with us for, we're now 5 deep. We're moving on to 6. We are still shaping episode 6. So unfortunately, we don't have a solid promo to give you this week, but we are going to try to do that going forward. So again, thank you.
And for uh, anyone who's actually checking YouTube out and watching our video content, um, I promise I'll get better. I promise it'll get better. My shifting eyes, my uncomfortable, it will get better. I will get better. Stick with me.
Again, it's broadcasting via laptop is such a weird niche skill
I just had
set.
to say
So
that.
don't beat yourself up over it at all.
Okay.
Dom,
Thank you, Jenna.
thank you. We'll talk again.
Yeah. Bye,
All right.
everyone.
Bye-bye. Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia. Music provided by Jay Cowett. Reach out to us anytime at layoffandlookingpod@gmail.com. New episodes drop every Friday at noon.